Chapter 13 of the D'Arblay Mystery. A Narrow Escape. The statement that I had made to Thorndyke was perfectly true in substance, but it was hardly as significant in fact as the words implied. I had, it is true, in my journeyings abroad, restricted myself to well-beaten thoroughfares, but then I had had no occasion to do otherwise. Until Polton's arrival on the scene, my time had been wholly taken up in keeping a watch on Marian, and so it would have continued if I had followed my own inclination. But at the end of the first day's work she intervened resolutely. "I am perfectly ashamed," she said, "to occupy the time of two men, both of whom have their own affairs to attend to, though I can't tell you how grateful I am to you for sacrificing yourselves." "We are acting under the doctor's orders, miss," said Polton, thereby, in his opinion, closing the subject. "You mean Dr. Thorndyke's?" said Marian, not realizing, or not choosing to realize, that to Polton there was no other doctor in the world who counted. "Yes, miss, the doctor's orders must be carried out." "Of course they must," she agreed warmly, "since he has been so very good as to take all this trouble about my safety. But there is no need for both of you to be here together. Couldn't you arrange to take turns on duty, alternate days or half-day each? I hate the thought that I am wasting the whole of both your times." I did not look on the suggestion with favor, for I was reluctant to yield up to any man, even to Polton, the privilege of watching over the safety of one who was so infinitely dear to me. Nor was Polton much less unwilling to agree, for he loathed to leave a piece of work uncompleted. However, Marian refused to accept our denials, as is the way of women, and the end of it was that Polton and I had to arrange our duties in half-day shifts, changing over at the end of each week, the first spell allotting the mornings to me and the latter half of the day, with the duty of seeing Marian home, to him. Thus, during each of the following 6 working days, I found myself with the entire afternoon and evening free. The former I usually spent at the hospital, but in the evenings, feeling too unsettled for study, I occupied myself very pleasantly with long walks through the inexhaustible streets, extending my knowledge of the town and making systematic explorations of such distant regions as Mile End, Kingsland, Dalston, Wapping, and the Borough. One evening I bethought me of my promise to look in on Usher. I did not find myself yearning for his society, but a promise is a promise. Accordingly, when I had finished my solitary dinner, I set forth for my lodgings in Camden Square and made a beeline for Clerkenwell, so far that is to say as was possible, while keeping to the wider streets. For in this respect, I followed Thorndyke's instructions to the letter, though as to the other matter, that of keeping a bright lookout, I was less attentive, my mind being much more occupied with thoughts of Marian, who would just now be on her way home under Polton's escort, than with any considerations of my own personal safety. Indeed, to tell the truth, I was inclined to be more than a little skeptical as to the need for these extraordinary precautions. I found Usher in the act of bowing out the last of the evening consultations, and was welcomed by him with enthusiasm. "Delighted to see you, old chap," he exclaimed, shaking my hand warmly. "It is good of you to drop in on an old fossil like me. Didn't much think you would. I suppose you don't often come this way?" "No," I replied, "it is rather off my beat. I've finished with Hoxton, for the present at any rate." "So have I," said Usher, "since poor old Cryle went off to the better land." "Cryle?" I repeated. "Who was he?" "Don't you remember my telling you about his funeral, when they had those Sunday school kids yowling hymns around the grave? That was Mr. Cryle, Christian name Jonathan." "I remember, but I didn't realize that he was a Hoxton aristocrat." "Well, he was. 52 Field Street was his earthly abode. I used to remember it by the number of weeks in the year. And glad enough I was when he hopped off his perch, for his confounded landlady, a Mrs. Pepper, would insist on fixing the times for my visits, and deuced inconvenient times too. Between 4 and 6 on Tuesdays and Fridays. I hate patients who turn your visits into appointments. Upsets your whole visiting list." "It seems to be the fashion in Hoxton," I remarked. "I had to make my visits at appointed times too. It would have been frightfully inconvenient if I had been busy. Is it often done?" "They will always do it if you let 'em. Of course, it is a convenience to a woman who doesn't keep a servant, to know what time the doctor is going to call, but it doesn't do to give way to him. I assented to this excellent principle, noting, however, that he seemed to have given way to him all the same. As we had been talking, we had gradually drifted from the surgery up a flight of stairs to a shabby, cozy little room on the first floor, where a cheerful fire was burning and a copper kettle on a trivet purred contentedly and breathed forth little clouds of steam. Usher inducted me into a large easy chair, the depressed seat of which suggested its customary use by an elephant of sedentary habits, and produced from a cupboard a spirit decanter, a high-shouldered Dutch gin bottle, a sugar basin, and a couple of tumblers and sugar crushers. "Whiskey or Hollands?" he demanded. And as curiosity led me to select the latter, he commented, "That's right, Gray. Good stuff, Hollands. Touches up the cubical epilithium, what? I am rather partial to a drop of Hollands." It was no empty profession. The initial dose made me open my eyes, and that was only a beginning. In a twinkling, as it seemed, his tumbler was empty and the collaboration of the bottle and the copper kettle was repeated. And so it went on for nearly an hour, until I began to grow quite uneasy, though without any visible cause so far as Usher was concerned. He did not turn a hair. He hadn't very many to turn for that matter, but I speak figuratively. The only effect that I could observe was an increasing fluency of speech with a tendency to discursiveness, and I must admit that his conversation was highly entertaining. But his evident intention to make a night of it set me planning to make my escape without appearing to slight his hospitality. How I should have managed it, unaided by the direct interposition of Providence, I cannot guess, for his conversation had now taken the form of an interminable sentence punctuated by indistinguishable commas, but in the midst of this steadily flowing stream of eloquence, the outer silence was rent by the sudden jangling of a bell. Usher stopped short, stared at me solemnly, deliberately emptied his tumbler, and stood up. "Night bell, old chappie," he explained. "Got to go out. But don't you disturb yourself. Back in a few minutes. Soon polish 'em off." "I'll walk round with you as far as your patient's house," said I, "and then I shall have to get home. It is past 10 and I have a longish walk to Camden Square." He was disposed to argue the point, but another violent jangling cut his protest short and sent him hurrying down the stairs with me close at his heels. A couple of minutes later we were out in the street, following in the wake of a hurrying figure, and looking at Usher as he walked sedately at my side, with his top hat, his whiskers, and his inevitable umbrella. I had the feeling that all those jorums of Hollands had been consumed in vain. In appearance, in manner, in speech, and in gait, he was just his normal self, with never a hint of any change from the status quo antebellum. Our course led us into the purlieus of St. John Street Road, where we presently turned into a narrow, winding, and curiously desolate little street, along which we proceeded for a few hundred yards, when our forerunner halted at a door into which he inserted a latch-key. When we arrived at the open door, inside which a shadowy figure was lurking, Usher stopped and held out his hand. "Good night, old chap," he said. "Sorry you can't come back with me. If you keep straight on and turn to the left at the crossroads, you will come out presently into King's Cross Road. Then you'll know your way. So long." He turned into the dark passage, the door was closed, and I went on my way. The little meandering street was singularly silent and deserted, and its windings cut off the light from the scanty street lamps so that stretches of it were in almost total darkness. As I strode forward, the echoes of my footfalls resounded with hollow reverberations which smote my ear, and ought to have smitten my conscience, causing me to wonder, with grim amusement, what Thorndyke would have said if he could have seen me thus setting his instructions at defiance. Indeed, I was so far sensible of the impropriety of my being in such a place at such an hour, that I was about to turn to take a look back along the street. But at the very moment that I halted within a few feet of a street lamp, something struck the brim of my hat with a sharp, weighty blow like the stroke of a hammer, and I heard a dull thud from the lamp-post. In an instant I spun round, mighty fierce, whipping out my pistol, cocking it, and pointing it down the street as I raced back toward the spot from whence the missile had appeared to come. There was not a soul in sight, nor any sound of movement, and the shallow doorway seemed to offer no possible hiding place. but some 30 yards back I came suddenly on a narrow opening like an empty doorway, but actually the entrance to a covered alley not more than 3 feet wide and as dark as a pocket. This was evidently the ambush, which I had passed like a fool without observing it, and I halted beside it, with my pistol still pointed, listening intently and considering what I had better do. My first impulse had been to charge into the alley, but a moment's reflection showed the futility of such a proceeding. Probably my assailant had made off by some well-known outlet, but in any case it would be sheer insanity for me to plunge into that pitch-dark passage. For if he were still lurking there, he would be invisible to me, whereas I should be a clear silhouette against the dim light of the street. Moreover, I had seen no one, and I could not shoot at any chance stranger whom I might find there. Reluctantly, I recognized that there was nothing for it but to retreat cautiously and be more careful in the future. My retirement would have looked an odd proceeding to an observer, if there had been one, for I had to retreat crabwise in order that I might keep the entrance of the alley covered with my pistol and yet see where I was going. When I reached the lamppost, I scanned the area of lighted ground beneath it, and almost at the first glance perceived an object like a largest marble lying in the road. It proved, when I picked it up, to be a leaden ball, like an old-fashioned musket ball, with one flattened side, which had prevented it from rolling away from the spot where it had fallen. I dropped it into my pocket and resumed my masterly retreat until, at length, the crossroads came into view. Then I quickened my pace, and as I reached the corner put away my pistol after slipping in the safety catch. Once more out in the lighted and frequented main streets, my thoughts were free to turn over this extraordinary experience. But I did not allow them to divert me from a very careful lookout. All my skepticism was gone now. I realized that Thorndyke had not been making mere vague guesses, but that he had clearly foreseen that something of this kind would probably happen. That was to me the most perplexing feature of this incomprehensible affair. I turned it over in my mind again and again, and could make nothing of it. I could see no adequate reason why this man should want to make away with me. True, I was Marian's protector, but that, even if he were aware of it, did not seem an adequate reason. Indeed, I could not see why he was seeking to make away with her, nor even was it clear to me that there had been a reasonable motive for murdering her father. But as to myself, I seemed to be out of the picture altogether. The man had nothing to fear from me or to gain by my death. That was how it appeared to me, and yet I saw plainly that I must be mistaken. There must be something behind all this, something that was unknown to me but was known to Thorndyke. What could it be? I found myself unable to make any sort of guess. In the end, I decided to call on Thorndyke the following evening, report the incident, and see if I could get any enlightenment from him. The first part of this program I carried out successfully enough, but the second presented more difficulties. Thorndyke was not a very communicative man, and a perfectly impossible one to pump. What he chose to tell he told freely, and beyond that no amount of ingenuity could extract the faintest shadow of a hint. "I am afraid I am disturbing you, sir," I said in some alarm as I noted a portentous heap of documents on the table. "No," he replied, "I have nearly finished, and I shall treat you as a friend, and keep you waiting while I do the little that is left." He turned to his papers and took up his pen, but paused to cast one of his quick, penetrating glances at me. "Has anything fresh happened?" he asked. "Our unknown friend has had a pot at me," I answered. "That is all." He laid down his pen, and leaning back in his chair, demanded particulars. I gave him an account of what had happened on the preceding night, and taking the leaden ball from my pocket, laid it on the table. He picked it up, examined it curiously, and then placed it on the letter balance. "Just over half an ounce," he said. "It is a mercy it missed your head. With that weight and the velocity indicated by the flattening, it would have dropped you insensible with a fractured skull." And then he would have come along and put the finishing touches, I suppose, but I wonder how he shot the thing. Could he have used an air gun? Thorndyke shook his head. An air gun that would discharge a ball of that weight would make quite a loud report, and you say you heard nothing. You are quite sure of that, by the way? Perfectly. The place was as silent as the grave. Then he must have used a catapult, and an uncommonly efficient weapon it is in skillful hands, and as portable as a pistol. You mustn't give him another chance, Gray. I am not going to if I can help it, but what the deuce does the fellow want to pot at me for? It is a most mysterious thing. Do you understand what it is all about, sir? I do not, he replied. My knowledge of the facts of this case is nearly all second-hand knowledge, derived from you. You know all that I know and probably more. That is all very well, sir, said I, but you foresaw that this was likely to happen. I didn't. Therefore you must know more about the case than I do. He chuckled softly. You are confusing knowledge and inference, said he. We had the same facts, but our inferences were not the same. It is just a matter of experience. You haven't squeezed out of the facts as much as they are capable of yielding. Come now, Gray. While I am finishing my work, you shall look over my notes of this case, and then you should take a sort of bird's-eye view of the whole case and see if anything new occurs to you. And you must add to those notes that this man has been at the enormous trouble of stalking you continuously, that he shadowed you to ushers, that he waited patiently for you to come out, that he followed you most skillfully, and took instant advantage of the first opportunity that you gave him. You might also note that he did not elect to overtake you and make a direct attack on you, as he did on Miss D'Arblay. Note those facts and consider what their significance may be. And now just go through this little dossier. It won't take you many minutes. He took out of a drawer a small portfolio, on the cover of which was written, J.D. D'Arblay, deceased, and passing it to me, returned to his documents. I opened it and found it to contain a number of separate abstracts, each duly headed with its descriptive title, and an envelope marked Photographs. Glancing over the abstracts, I saw that they dealt respectively with J. D'Arblay, the inquest, the Van Zelen case, Miss D'Arblay, Dr. Gray, and Mr. Morris, the last containing, somewhat to my surprise, all the details that I had given Thorndyke respecting that rather mysterious person, together with an account of my dealings with him and cross-references to the abstract bearing my name. It was all very complete and methodical, but none of the abstracts contained any information that was new to me. If this represented all the facts that were known to Thorndyke, then he was no better informed than I was. But he had evidently got a great deal more out of the information than I had. Returning the abstracts with some disappointment to the portfolio, I turned to the photographs, and then I got a very thorough surprise. There were only 3, and the first 2 were of no great interest, one representing the 2 casts of the guinea and the other the plaster mask of Morris. But the third fairly took away my breath. It was a very bad photograph, apparently an enlargement from a rather poor snapshot portrait, but bad as it was, it gave a very vivid presentment of one of the most evil-looking faces that I have ever looked on. A lean, bearded face, with high cheekbones, with heavy frowning brows that overhung deep-shadowed, hollow eye sockets, an almost grotesquely large nose, thin, curved, and sharp, that jutted out like a great predatory beak. I stared at the photograph in speechless amazement. At the first glance I had been struck by the perfect way in which this crude portrait realized Marian's description of the man who had tried to murder her. But that was not all. There was another resemblance which I now perceived with even more astonishment. Indeed, it was so incredible that the perception of it reduced me to something like stupefaction. I sat for fully a minute with the portrait in my hand, and my thoughts surging confusedly in a vain effort to grasp the meaning of this extraordinary likeness. Then, happening to glance up at Thorndyke, I found him quietly regarding me with undisguised interest. "Well?" he said, as he caught my eye. "Who is he?" I demanded, holding up the photograph. "That is what I want to know," he replied. "The photograph came to me without any description. The identity of the subject is unknown. Who do you think he is?" "To begin with," I answered, "he exactly corresponds in appearance with Miss D'Arblay's description of her would-be murderer. Don't you think so?" "I do," he replied. "The correspondence seems complete in every detail, so far as I can judge. That was why I secured the photograph, but the actual resemblance will have to be settled by her. I suggest that you take the portrait and let her see it, but you had better not show it to her pointedly for identification. It would be better to put it in some place where she will see it without previous suggestion or preparation. But you said just now, to begin with. Was there anything else that struck you about this photograph?" Yes, I answered, there was. A most amazing thing. You remember me telling you about the patient I attended in Morris's house? The man who died of gastric cancer and was eventually cremated. Yes, his name was Bendelow. Well, this photograph might have been a portrait of Bendelow, taken with a beard and mustache before the disease got hold of him. Excepting for the emaciation in the beard, Bendelow was clean-shaved. I should think it would be quite an excellent likeness of him. Thorndyke made no immediate reply or comment, but sat quite still, looking at me with a very singular expression. I could see that he was thinking rapidly and intensely, but I suspected that his thoughts were in a good deal less confusion than mine had been. It is, he remarked at length, as you say, a most amazing affair. The face is no ordinary face. It would be difficult to mistake it, and one would have to go far to find another with which it could be confused. Still, one must not forget the possibility of a chance resemblance. Nature doesn't take out letters patent even for a human face. But I will ask you, Gray, to write down and send to me all that you know about the late Mr. Bendelow, including all the details of your attendance on him, dead and alive. I will, said I, though it is difficult to imagine what connection he could have had with the D'Arblay case. It seems incredible that he could have had any, Thorndyke agreed. But at present we are collecting facts, and we must note everything impartially. It is a fatal mistake to select your facts in accordance with the apparent probabilities. By the way, if Bendelow was like this photograph, he must have corresponded pretty exactly with Miss D'Arblay's very complete and lucid description. I wonder why you did not realize that at the time. That is what I have been wondering. But I suppose it was the beard and the absence of any kind of association between Bendelow and the D'Arblays. Probably, he agreed. A beard and mustache alters very greatly even a striking face like this. Incidentally, it illustrates the superiority of a picture over a verbal description for purposes of identification. No mere description will enable you to visualize correctly a face which you have never seen. I shall be curious to hear what Miss D'Arblay has to say about this photograph. I will let you know without delay, said I. And then, as he seemed to have completed his work and put the documents aside, I made a final effort to extract some definite information from him. It is evident, I said, that the body of facts in your notes has conveyed a good deal more to you than it has to me. Probably, he agreed. If it had not, I should seem to have profited little by years of professional practice. Then, I said persuasively, may I ask if you have formed a really satisfactory theory as to who this man is and why he murdered D'Arblay? Thorndyke reflected for a few moments and then replied, My position, Gray, is this. I have arrived at a very definite theory as to the motive of the murder, and a most extraordinary motive it is. But there are one or two points that I do not understand. There are some links missing from the chain of evidence. So with the identity of the man. We know pretty certainly that he is the murderer of Van Zelen, and we know what he is like to look at, but we can't give him a name and a definite personality. There are links missing there too. But I have great hopes of finding those missing links. If I find them, I shall have a complete case against this man, and I shall forthwith set the law in motion. I can't tell you more than that at present, but I repeat that you are in possession of all the facts, and that if you think over all that has happened and ask yourself what it could mean, though you will not arrive at a complete solution any more than I have, you will at least begin to see the light. This was all that I could get out of him, and as it was now growing late, I presently rose to take my departure. He walked with me as far as the Middle Temple gate and stood outside the wicket, watching me as I strode away westward. Chapter 14. The Haunted Man. When I arrived at the studio on the following afternoon, I found the door open and Polton waiting just inside with his hat and overcoat on and his bag in his hand. "I am glad you were punctual, sir," he said, with his benevolent smile. "I wanted to get back to the chambers in good time today. It won't matter tomorrow, which is fortunate, as you may be late." "Why may I be late tomorrow?" I asked. "I have a message for you from the doctor," he replied. "It is about what you were discussing last night. He told me to tell you that he is expecting a visit from an officer of the Criminal Investigations Department, and he would like you to be present, if it would be convenient. About 10:30, sir." "I will certainly be there," said I. "Thank you, sir," said he. "And the doctor told me to warn you, in case you should arrive after the officer, not to make any comment on anything that may be said, or to seem to know anything about the subject of the interview." "This is very mysterious, Polton," I remarked. "Why, not particularly, sir," he replied. "You see, the officer is coming to give certain information, but he will try to get some for himself if he can. But he won't get anything out of the doctor, and the only way for you to prevent his pumping you is to say nothing and appear to know nothing." I laughed at his ingenious wiliness. "Why," I exclaimed, "you are as bad as the doctor, Polton. A regular Machiavelli." "I never heard of him," said Polton, "but most Scotsmen are pretty close. Oh, and there is another little matter that I wanted to speak to you about, on my own account this time. I gathered from the doctor in confidence that someone had been following you about. Now, sir, don't you think it would be very useful to be able to see behind you without turning your head?" "By Jove," I exclaimed, "it would indeed. Capital. I never thought of it. I will have a supplementary eye fixed in the back of my head without delay." Polton crinkled deprecatingly. "No need for that, sir," said he. "I have invented quite a lot of different appliances for enabling you to see behind you, reflecting spectacles and walking sticks with prisms in the handle and so on. But for use at night, I think this will answer your purpose best." He produced from his pocket an object somewhat like a watchmaker's eyeglass, and having fixed it in his eye to show me how it worked, handed it to me with the request that I would try it. I did so, and was considerably surprised at the efficiency of the appliance, for it gave me a perfectly clear view of the street almost directly behind me. "I am very much obliged to you, Polton," I said enthusiastically. "This is a most valuable gift, especially under the present circumstances." He was profoundly gratified. "I think you will find it useful, sir," he said. "The doctor uses these things sometimes, and so do I if the occasion arises. You see, sir, if you are being shadowed, it is a fatal thing to turn round and look behind you. You never get a chance of seeing what the stalker is like, and you put him on his guard." I saw this clearly enough, and once more thanked him for his timely gift. Then, having shaken his hand and sped him on his way, I entered the lobby and shut the outer door, at the same time transferring Thorndyke's photograph from my letter case to my jacket pocket. When I passed through into the studio, I found Marion putting the finishing touches to a plaster case. She greeted me with a smile as I entered, and then plunged her hand once more into the bowl of rapidly thickening plaster, whereupon I took the opportunity to lay the photograph on a side bench as I walked towards the table on which she was working. "Good afternoon, Marion," said I. "Good afternoon, Stephen," she responded, adding, "I cannot shake hands until I have washed," and held out her emplastered hands in evidence. "That will be too late," said I, and as she looked up at me inquiringly, I stooped and kissed her. "You are very resourceful," she remarked with a smile and a warm blush, as she scooped up another handful of plaster, and then, as if to cover her slight confusion, she asked, "What was all that solemn powwow about with Mr. Polton, and why did he wait for you at the door in that suspicious manner? Had he some secret message for you?" "I don't know whether it was intended to be secret," I answered, "but it isn't going to be so far as you are concerned," and I repeated to her the substance of Thorndyke's message, to which she listened with an eagerness that rather surprised me, until her further inquiries explained it. "This sounds rather encouraging," she said, as if Dr. Thorndyke had been making some progress in his investigations. "I wonder if he has. Do you think he really knows much more than we do?" "I am sure he does," I replied, "but how much more I cannot guess. He is extraordinarily close, but I have a feeling that the end is not so very far off. He seems to be quite hopeful of laying his hand on this villain." "Oh, I hope you are right, Stephen," she exclaimed. "I have been getting so anxious. There seemed to be no end to this deadlock, and yet it can't go on indefinitely." "What do you mean, Marion?" I asked. "I mean," she answered, "that you can't go on wasting your time here and letting your career go. Of course it is delightful to have you here. I don't dare think what the place would be like without you. But it makes me wretched to think how much you are sacrificing for me." "I am not really sacrificing anything," said I. "On the contrary, I am spending my time most profitably in the pursuit of knowledge and most happily in a sweet companionship which I wouldn't exchange for anything in the world." "It is very nice of you to say that," she said, "but still I shall be very relieved when the danger is over and you are free." "Free?" I exclaimed. "I don't want to be free. When my apprenticeship is run out, I am coming on as a journeyman. And now I had better get my blouse on and start work." I went to the further end of the studio, and taking the blouse down from its peg, proceeded to exchange it for my coat. Suddenly I was startled by a sharp cry, and turning round, beheld Marion stooping over the photograph with an expression of utmost horror. "Where did this come from?" she demanded, turning a white, terror-stricken face on me. "I put it there, Marion," I answered somewhat sheepishly, hurrying to her side. "But what is the matter? Do you know the man?" "Do I know him?" she repeated. "Of course I do. It is he, the man who came here that night." "Are you quite sure?" I asked. "Are you certain that it is not just a chance resemblance?" She shook her head emphatically. "It is he, Stephen. I can swear to him. It is no mere resemblance. It is a likeness, and a perfect one, though it is such a bad photograph. But where did you get it? And why didn't you show it to me when you came in?" I told her how I came by it and explained Thorndyke's instructions. Then she said, "Dr. Thorndyke knows who the man is." "He says he doesn't, and he was very close and rather obscure as to how the photograph came into his possession." "It is very mysterious," said she, with another terrified glance at the photograph. Then suddenly she snatched it up and with averted face held it out to me. "Put it away, Stephen," she entreated. "I can't bear the sight of that horrible face. It brings back afresh all the terrors of that awful night." I hastily returned the photograph to my letter case and, taking her arm, led her back to the work table. "Now," I said, "let us forget it and get on with our work." And I proceeded to turn the case over and fix it in the new position with lumps of clay. For a little while she watched me in silence, and I could see by her pallor that she was still suffering from shock of that unexpected encounter. But presently she picked up a scraper and joined me in trimming up the edges of the case, cutting out the keyways and making ready for the second half, and by degrees her color came back and the interest of the work banished her terrors. We were, in fact, extremely industrious. We not only finished the case, it was an arm from the shoulder which was to be made, cutting the pouring holes and varnishing the inside with knotting, but we filled one half with the melted gelatin which was to form the actual mold in which the wax would be cast. This brought the day's work to an end, for nothing more could be done until the gelatin had set, a matter of at least 12 hours. "It is too late to begin anything afresh," said Marion. "You had better come and have supper with me and Arabella." I agreed readily enough to this proposal, and when we had tied it up in readiness for the morning's work, we set forth at a brisk pace, for it was a cold evening, towards Highgate, gossiping cheerfully as we went. By the time we reached Ivy Cottage, 8 o'clock was striking, and the village was beginning to settle down for the night. The premature quiet reminded me that the adjacent town would presently be settling down too, and that I should do well to start for home before the streets had become too deserted. Nevertheless, so pleasantly did the time slip away in the cozy sitting room with my two companions that it was close upon 10:30 when I rose to take my departure. Marion escorted me to the door, and as I stood in the hall buttoning up my overcoat, she said, "You needn't worry if you are detained tomorrow. We shall be making the wax cast of the bust, and I am certain Mr. Polton won't leave the studio until it is finished, whether you are there or not. He is perfectly mad on waxwork. He wormed all the secrets of the trade out of me the very first time we were alone, and he is extraordinarily quick at learning. But I can't imagine what use the knowledge will be to him." "Perhaps he thinks of starting an opposition establishment," I suggested. "Or he may have an eye to a partnership. But if he has, he will have a competitor, and one with a prior claim. Good night, dear child. Save some of the waxwork for me tomorrow." She promised to restrain Polton's enthusiasm as far as possible, and wishing me good night, held out her hand, but submitted without demur to being kissed, and I took my departure in high spirits, more engrossed with the pleasant leave-taking than with the necessity of keeping a bright lookout. I was nearing the bottom of the high street when the prevailing quiet recalled me to the grim realities of my position, and I was on the point of stopping to take a look round when I bethought me of Polton's appliance and also of that cunning artificer's advice not to put a possible stalker on his guard. I accordingly felt in my pocket, and having found the appliance, carefully fixed it in my eye without altering my pace. The first result was a collision with a lamppost, which served to remind me of the necessity of keeping both eyes open. The instrument was, in fact, not very easy to use while walking, and it took me a minute or two to learn how to manage it. Presently, however, I found myself able to divide my attention between the pathway in front and the view behind, and then it was that I became aware of a man following me at a distance of about 100 yards. Of course, there was nothing remarkable or suspicious in this, for it was a main thoroughfare and by no means deserted at this comparatively early hour. Nevertheless, I kept the man in view, noting that he wore a cloth cap and a monkey jacket, that he carried no stick or umbrella, and that when I slightly slackened my pace he did not seem to overtake me. As this suggested that he was accommodating his pace to mine, I decided to put the matter to the test by giving him an opportunity to pass me at the next side turning. At this moment the Roman Catholic Church came into view, and I recalled that at its side a narrow lane, Dartmouth Park Hill, ran down steeply between high fences towards Kentish Town. Instantly I decided to turn into the lane, which bent sharply to the left behind the church, walk a few yards down it, and then return slowly. If my follower were a harmless stranger, he would then have passed on down Highgate Hill, whereas if he were stalking me I should meet him at the entrance to the lane, and could then see what he was like. But I was not very satisfied with this plan, for the obvious maneuver would show him that he was suspected, and as I approached the church a better plan suggested itself. On one side by the entrance to the lane were some low railings and a gate with large brick piers. In a moment I had vaulted over the railings and taken up a position behind one of the piers, where I stood motionless, listening intently. Very soon I caught the sound of distinctly rapid footsteps, which suddenly grew louder as my follower came opposite the entrance to the lane, and louder still as, without a moment's hesitation, he turned into it. From my hiding place in the deep shadow of the pier, I could safely peep out into the wide space at the entrance of the lane, and as this space was well lighted by a lamp, I was able to get an excellent view of my follower. And very much puzzled I was therewith. Naturally, I had expected to recognize the man whose photograph I had in my pocket. But this was quite a different type of man. It is true that he was shortish and rather slightly built, and that he had a beard, but there the resemblance ended. His face, which I could see plainly by the lamplight, so far from being an aquiline or vulturine cast, was rather of the blunt and bibulous type. The short, though rather bulbous nose made up in color what it lacked in size, and its florid tint extended into the cheek on either side in the form of what dermatologists call acne rosacea. I say that his appearance puzzled me, but it was not his appearance alone, for the latter showed that he was a stranger to me and suggested that he was going down the lane on his lawful occasions, but his movements did not support that suggestion. He had turned into the lane and passed my hiding place at a very quick walk, but just as he reached the sharp turn he slackened his pace, stepping lightly, and then stopped for a moment, listening intently and peering forward into the darkness of the lane. At length he started again and disappeared round the corner, and by the sound of his retreating footsteps I could tell that he was once more putting on the pace. I listened until these sounds had nearly died away, and was just about to emerge from my shelter when I became aware of footsteps approaching from the opposite direction. And as I did not choose to be seen in the act of climbing the railings, I decided to remain perdu until this person had passed. These footsteps, too, had a distinctly hurried sound, a fact which I noted with some surprise. But I was a good deal more surprised when the newcomer turned sharply into the entrance, walked swiftly past my ambush, and then, as he approached the corner, suddenly slowed down, advancing cautiously on tiptoe, and finally halted to listen and stare into the obscurity of the lane. I peered out at this new arrival with an amazement that I cannot describe. Like the first man, he was a complete stranger to me. A tallish, athletic-looking man of about 35, not ill-looking, and having something of a military air, fair-complexioned, with a sandy mustache, but otherwise clean-shaved and dressed in a suit of thick tweed, with no overcoat. I could see these details clearly by the light of the lamp, and even as I was noting them, he disappeared round the corner and I could hear him walking quickly but lightly down the lane. As soon as he was gone, I looked out from my hiding place and listened attentively. There was no one in sight, nor could I hear anyone approaching. I accordingly came forth and, quickly climbing over the railings, stood for a few moments irresolute. The obviously reasonable thing to do was to make off down Highgate Hill as fast as I could and take the first conveyance that I could get homeward. But that appearance of that second man had inflamed me with curiosity. What was he here for? Was he shadowing me, or was he in pursuit of the other man? Either supposition was incredible, but one of them must be true. The end of it was that curiosity got the better of discretion, and I too started down the lane, walking as fast as I could, and treading as lightly as circumstances permitted. The second man was some considerable distance ahead, for his footsteps came to me but faintly, and I did not seem to be gaining on him, and I took it that his speed was a fair measure of that of the man in front. Keeping thus within hearing of my quarry, I sped on, turning over the amazing situation in my bewildered mind. The first man was a mystery to me, though apparently not to Thorndyke. Who could he be? And why on earth was he taking this prodigious amount of trouble to get rid of a harmless person like myself? For there could be no mistake as to the magnitude of the efforts that he was making. He must have waited outside the studio, followed Marion and me to her home, and there kept a patient vigil of over 2 hours, waiting for me to come out. It was a stupendous labor, and what was it all about? I could not form the most shadowy guess, while as to the other man, the very thought of him reduced me to a state of hopeless bewilderment. As my reflections petered out to this rather nebulous conclusion, I halted for a moment to listen for the footsteps ahead. They were still audible, though they sounded somewhat farther away. But now I caught the sound of other footsteps, approaching from behind. Someone else was coming down the lane. Of course, there was nothing surprising in that circumstance, for, after all, this was a public thoroughfare, little frequented as it was, especially after dark. Nevertheless, something in the character of those footsteps put me on the qui-vive. For this man, too, was walking quickly, very quickly, and with a certain stealthiness, as if he had rubber-soled boots, and, like the rest of us, was making as little noise as possible. I walked on at my previous rapid pace, keeping my ears cocked now both fore and aft, and as I went my mind surged with wild speculations. Could it be that I had yet another follower? The thing was becoming grotesque. My bewilderment began to mingle with a spice of grim amusement, but still I listened, not without anxiety, to those footsteps from behind, which seemed to be growing rapidly more distinct. Whoever this newcomer might be, he was no mean walker, for he was overtaking me apace, and this fact gave a pretty broad hint as to his size and strength. I looked back from time to time, but without stopping or slackening my pace, trying to pierce the deep obscurity of the narrow closed-in lane. But it was a dark winter's night, and the high fences shut out even the glimmer from the murky sky. It was not until the approaching footfalls sounded quite near that I was able, at length, to make out a smear of deeper darkness on the general obscurity. Then I drew out my pistol and, withdrawing the safety catch, put my hand, grasping it, into my overcoat pocket. Having thus made ready for possible contingencies, I watched the black shape emerge from the darkness until it developed into a tall, portly man, bearing down on me with long, swinging strides, when I halted and drew back against the fence to let him pass. But he had no intention of passing. As he came up to me, he too halted, and looking into my face with undissembled curiosity, he addressed me in a brusque though not uncivil tone. "Now, sir, I must ask you to explain what is going on." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "I'll tell you," he replied. "I saw you, a little time ago, climb over the railings and hide behind a gatepost. Then I saw a man come up in a deuce of a hurry and turn into the lane. I saw him stop and listen for a moment and then bustle off down the hill. Close on this fellow's heels came another man, also in a devil of a hurry. He turns into the lane too, and suddenly he pulls up and creeps forward on tiptoe like a cat on hot bricks. He stops and listens too, and then off he goes down the lane like a lamplighter. Then out you come from behind the gatepost, over the railings you climb, and then you creep up to the corner and listen, and then off you go down the hill like another lamplighter. Now, sir, what's it all about?" "I assume," said I, repressing a strong tendency to giggle, "that you have some authority for making these inquiries?" "I have, sir," he replied. "I am a police officer on plainclothes duty. I happened to be at the corner of Hornsey Lane when I saw you coming down the high street, walking in a queer sort of way, as if you couldn't see where you were going. So I drew back into the shadow and had a look at you. Then I saw you nip into the lane and climb over the railings, so I waited to see what was going to happen next. And then those other two came along. Well now, I ask you again, sir, what's going on? What is it all about?" "The fact is," I said a little sheepishly, "I thought the first man was following me, so I hid just to see what he was up to." "What about the second man?" "I don't know anything about him." "What do you know about the first man?" "Nothing, except that he certainly was following me." "Why should he be following you?" "I can't imagine. He is a stranger to me, and so is the other man." Said the officer, regarding me with a distrustful eye. "Damn funny affair. I think you had better walk up to the station with me and give us a few particulars about yourself." "I will with pleasure," said I, "but I am not altogether a stranger there. Inspector Follett knows me quite well. My name is Gray, Dr. Gray." The officer did not reply for a few moments. He seemed to be listening to something, and now my ear caught the sound of footsteps approaching hurriedly from down the lane. As they drew near, my friend peered into the darkness and muttered in an undertone, "Will that be one of 'em coming back?" He listened again for a moment or two, and then, resuming his inquiries, said aloud, "You say Inspector Follett knows you. Well, perhaps you had better come and see Inspector Follett." As he finished speaking, he again listened intently, and his mouth opened slightly. I suspect my own did too, for the footsteps had ceased. Now there was a dead silence in the lane. "That chap has stopped to listen," my new friend remarked in a low voice. "We had better see what his game is. Come along, sir," and with this he strode off at a pace that taxed my powers to keep up with him. But at the very moment that he started, the footsteps became audible again, only now they were obviously retreating. Straining my ears, I caught the faint sound of other and more distant footfalls, also retreating, so far as I could judge, and in the same hurried fashion. For a couple of minutes the officer swung along like a professional pedestrian, and I struggled on just behind him, perspiring freely, and wishing that I could shed my overcoat. Still, despite our efforts, there was no sign of our gaining on the men ahead. My friend evidently realized this, for he presently growled over his shoulder, "This won't do," and forthwith broke into a run. Instantly, this acceleration communicated itself to the men in front. The rhythm of both sets of footfalls showed that our forerunners were literally justifying that description of them, and as both had necessarily given up any attempt to move silently, the sounds of their retreat were borne to us quite distinctly. And from those sounds the unsatisfactory conclusion emerged that they were drawing ahead pretty rapidly. My friend, the officer, was, as I have said, an uncommonly fine walker, but he was no runner. His figure was against him. He was fully 6 feet in height, and he had a presence. He could have walked me off my legs, but when it came to running, I found myself ambling behind him with such ease that I was able to get out my pistol and, after replacing the safety catch, stow the weapon in my hip pocket out of harm's way. However, if my friend was no sprinter, he was certainly a stayer, for he lumbered on doggedly until the lane entered the new neighborhood of Dartmouth Park, and here it was that the next act opened. We had just passed the end of the first of the streets when I saw a surprisingly agile policeman dart out from a shady corner and follow on in our wake in proper Lilliebridge style. I immediately put on a spurt and shot past my companion, and a few moments later sounds of objurgation arose from behind. I stopped at once and turned back, just in time to hear an apologetic voice exclaim, "I'm sure I beg your pardon, Mr. Plonk. I didn't recognize you in the dark." "No, of course you wouldn't," replied the plainclothes officer. "Did you see 2 men run past here just now?" "I did," answered the constable, "one after the other, and both running as if the devil was after them. I was halfway up the street, but I popped down to have a look at them, and when I got to the corner I heard you coming, so I just kept out of sight and waited for you." "Quite right too," said Mr. Plump. "Well, I don't see or hear anything of those chaps now." "No," agreed the constable, "and you are not likely to. There's a regular maze of new streets about here. You can take it that they've got clear away." "Yes, I'm afraid they have," said Plump. "Well, it can't be helped, and there's nothing much in it. Good night, constable." He moved off briskly, not wishing apparently to discuss the affair, and in a few minutes we came to the wide crossroads. Here he halted and looked me over by the light of a street lamp. Apparently the result was satisfactory, for he said, "It's hardly worth while to take you all the way back to the station at this time of night. Where do you live?" I told him Camden Square and offered a card in corroboration. "Then you are pretty close to home," said he, inspecting my card. "Very well, Doctor. I'll speak to Inspector Follett about this affair, and if you have any further trouble of this sort you had better let us know. And you had better let us have a description of the men in any case." I promised to send him the particulars on the following day, and we then parted with mutual good wishes, he making his way towards Holloway Road, and I setting my face homeward by way of the Brecknock Road, and keeping an uncommonly sharp lookout as I went. Chapter 15. Thorndyke proposes a new move. On the following morning, in order to make sure of arriving before the detective officer, I presented myself at King's Bench Walk a good half-hour before I was due. The door was opened by Thorndyke himself, and as we shook hands he said, "I am glad you have come early, Gray. No doubt Polton explained the program to you, but I should like to make our position quite clear. The officer who is coming here presently is Detective Superintendent Miller of the Criminal Investigations Department. He is quite an old friend, and he is coming at my request to give me certain information. But of course he is a detective officer, with his own duties to his department, and an exceedingly shrewd, capable man. Naturally, if he can pick up any crumbs of information from us, he will, and I don't want him to learn more, at present, than I choose to tell him." "Why do you want to keep him in the dark?" I asked. "Because," he replied, "we are doing quite well, and I want to get the case complete before I call in the police. If I were to tell him all I know and all I think, he might get too busy and scare our man away before we have enough evidence to justify an arrest. As soon as the investigation is finished, and we have such evidence as will secure a conviction, I shall turn the case over to him. Meanwhile, we keep our own counsel. Your role this morning will be that of listener. Whatever happens, make no comment. Act as if you knew nothing that is not of public knowledge." I promised to follow his directions to the letter, though I could not get rid of the feeling that all this secrecy was somewhat futile. Then I began to tell him of my experiences of the previous night, to which he listened at first with grave interest, but with growing amusement as the story developed. When I came to the final chase and the pursuing policeman, he leaned back in his chair and laughed heartily. "Why," he exclaimed, wiping his eyes, "it was a regular procession. It only wanted a string of sausages and a harlequin to bring it up to pantomime form." "Yes," I admitted with a grin, "it was a ludicrous affair. But it was a mighty mysterious affair, too. You see, neither of the men was the man I had expected. There must be more people in this business than we had supposed. Have you any idea who these men can be?" "It isn't much use making vague guesses," he replied. "The important point to note is that this incident, farcical as it turned out, might easily have taken a tragical turn, and the moral is that for the present you can't be too careful in keeping out of harm's way." It was obvious to me that he was evading my question, that those two sinister strangers were not the mystery to him that they were to me, and I was about to return to the charge with a more definitely pointed question when an elaborate flourish on the little brass knocker of the inner door announced a visitor. The tall, military-looking man whom Thorndyke admitted was evidently the superintendent, as I gathered from the mutual greetings. He looked rather hard at me until Thorndyke introduced me, which he did with characteristic reticence. "This is Dr. Gray, Miller. You may remember his name. It was he who discovered the body of Mr. D'Arblay." "Yes, I remember," said the superintendent, shaking my hand unemotionally and still looking at me with a slightly dubious air. "He is a good deal interested in the case," Thorndyke continued, "not only professionally, but as a friend of the family, since the catastrophe." "I see," said the superintendent, taking a final inquisitive look at me and obviously wondering why the deuce I was there. "Well, there is nothing of a very secret nature in what I have to tell you, and I suppose you can rely on Dr. Gray to keep his own counsel and ours." "Certainly," replied Thorndyke. "He quite understands that our talk is confidential, even if it is not secret." The officer nodded, and having been inducted into an easy chair, by the side of which a decanter, a siphon, and a box of cigars had been placed, settled himself comfortably, lit a cigar, mixed himself a modest refresher, and drew from his pocket a bundle of papers secured with red tape. "You asked me, Doctor," he began, "to get you all particulars up to date of the Van Zelen case. Well, I can do that without difficulty, as the case, or at least what is left of it, is in my hands. The circumstances of the actual crime I think you know already, so I will take up the story from that point. Van Zelen, as you know, was found dead in his room, poisoned with prussic acid, and a quantity of very valuable portable property was missing. It was not clear whether the murderer had let himself in with false keys or whether Van Zelen had let him in, but the place hadn't been broken into. The job had been done with remarkable skill, so that not a trace of the murderer was left. Consequently, all that was left for the police to do was to consider whether they knew anyone whose methods agreed with those of this murderer. Well, they did know of such a person, but they had nothing against him but suspicion. He had never been convicted of any serious crime, though he had been in chokey once or twice for receiving. But there had been a number of cases of robbery with murder, or rather murder with robbery, for this man seemed to have committed the murder as a preliminary precaution, and they were all of this kind, a solitary crime, very skillfully carried out by means of poison. There was never any trace of the criminal, but gradually the suspicions of the police settled down on a rather mysterious individual of the name of Bendelow, Simon Bendelow. Consequently, when the Van Zelen crime came to light, they were inclined to put it on this man Bendelow, and they began making fresh inquiries about him. But presently it transpired that someone had seen a man, on the morning of the crime, coming away from the neighborhood of Van Zelen's house just about the time when the murder must have been committed. Was there anything to connect him with the crime? Thorndyke asked. Well, there was the time, the small hours of the morning, and the man was carrying a good-sized handbag, which seemed to be pretty heavy and which would have held the stuff that was missing. But the most important point was the man's appearance. He was described as a smallish man, clean-shaved, with a big hooked nose and very heavy eyebrows set close down over his eyes. Now this put Bendelow out of it as the principal suspect, because the description didn't fit him at all. Here I caught Thorndyke's eye for an instant, and was warned afresh, and not unnecessarily, to make no comment. But, continued the superintendent, it didn't put him out altogether. For the man whom the description did fit, and it fitted him to a T, was a fellow named Cryle, Jonathan Cryle, who was a pal of Bendelow's and was known to have worked with him as a confederate in the receiving business and had been in prison once or twice. So the police started to make inquiries about Cryle, and before long they were able to run him to earth. But that didn't do them much good, for it turned out that Cryle wasn't in New York at all. He was in Philadelphia, and it was clearly proved that he had been there on the day of the murder, on the day before and the day after. So they seemed to have drawn a blank, but they were still a bit suspicious of Mr. Cryle, who seems to have been as downy a bird as his friend Bendelow, and of the other chappie too, but they hadn't a crumb of evidence against either. So there the matter stuck, a complete deadlock. There was nothing to be done, for you can't arrest a man on mere suspicion with not a single fact to support it. But the police kept their eye on both gents as far as they could, and presently they got a chance. Bendelow made a slip, or at any rate they said he did. It was a little trumpery affair, something in the receiving line, and of no importance at all. Probably a fake charge, too. But they thought that if they could get him arrested, they might be able to squeeze something out of him. The police in America can do things that we aren't allowed to. So they tried to pounce on him. But Mr. Bendelow was a slippery customer, and he got wind of their intentions just in time. When they got into his rooms, they found that he had left, in a deuce of a hurry too, and only a few minutes before they arrived. They searched the place but found nothing incriminating, and they tried to get on Bendelow's track, but they didn't succeed. He had managed to get clear away, and Crowell seemed to have disappeared too. Well, that seemed to be the end of the affair. Both of these crooks had made off without leaving a trace, and the police, having no evidence, didn't worry any more about them. And so things went on for about a year, until the Van Zelen case had been given up and nearly forgotten. Then something happened quite recently that gave the police a fresh start. It appears that there was a fire in the house in which Bendelow's rooms were, and a good deal of damage was done, so that they had to do some rebuilding, and in the course of the repairs the builders' men found, hidden under the floorboards, a small parcel containing part of the Van Zelen swag. It was nothing of real value, just coins and medals and seal rings and truck of that kind, but the things were all identified by means of Van Zelen's catalogue, and of course the finding of them in what had been Bendelow's rooms put the murder pretty clearly onto him. On this, as you can guess, the police and the detective agencies got busy. They searched high and low for the missing man, but for a long time they could pick up no traces of him. At last they discovered that he and Crowell had taken a passage nearly a year ago on a tramp steamer bound for England. Thereupon they sent a very smart, experienced detective over to work at the case in conjunction with their own detective department. But we didn't have much to do with it. The American, Wilson was his name, had all the particulars, with the prison photographs and fingerprints of both the men, and he made most of the inquiries himself. However, there were two things that we did for him. We handed over to him the Van Zelen guinea and the particulars of the D'Arblay murder, and we were able to inform him that his friend Bendelow was dead. "How did you find that out?" Thorndyke asked. "Oh, quite by chance. One of our men happened to be at Somerset House looking up some details of a will, when in the list of wills he came across the name of Simon Bendelow, which he had heard from Wilson himself. He at once got out the will, copied out the address of the executrix and the names and addresses of the witnesses, and handed them over to Wilson, who was mightily taken aback, as you may suppose. However, he wasn't taking anything for granted. He set off instantly to look up the executrix, then Mrs. Morris. But there he got another disappointment, for the Morrises had gone away and no one knew where they had gone. "I take it," said Thorndyke, "that probate of the will had been granted." Yes, everything in that way had been finished up. Well, on this, Wilson went off in search of the witnesses, and he had better luck this time. They were two elderly spinsters who lived together in a house in Turnpike Lane, Hornsey. They didn't know much about Bendelow, for they had only made his acquaintance after he had taken to his bed. They were introduced to him by his friend and landlady, Mrs. Morris, who used to take them up to his room to talk to him and cheer him up a bit. However, they knew all about his death, for they had seen him in his coffin, and they followed him to the Ilford crematorium. "Huh," said Thorndyke, "so he was cremated." "Yes," chuckled the superintendent, with a sly look at Thorndyke. "I thought that would make you prick up your ears, Doctor. Yes, there were no half measures for Mr. Bendelow. He had gone literally to ashes. But it was all right, you know. There couldn't have been any hanky-panky. These two ladies had not only seen him in his coffin, they actually had a last look at him through a little celluloid window in the coffin lid, just before the coffin was passed through into the cremation furnace." "And there was no doubt as to his identity?" "None whatever. Wilson showed the old ladies his photograph, and they recognized him instantly, picked his photograph out of a dozen others." "Where was Bendelow living when they made his acquaintance?" "Not far from their house in Abbey Road, Hornsey. But the Morrises moved afterwards to Market Street, Hoxton, and that is where he died and where the will was signed." "I suppose Wilson ascertained the cause of death?" "Oh, yes. The old ladies told him that. But he went to Somerset House and got a copy of the death certificate. I haven't got that, as he took it back with him, but the cause of death was cancer of the pylorus. That's some part of the gizzard, I believe, but you'll know all about it." At any rate, there was no doubt on the subject, as the two doctors made a post-mortem before they signed the death certificate. It was all perfectly plain and straightforward. Well, so much for Mr. Bendelow. When Wilson had done with him, he turned his attention to Cryle. And then he really did get a proper shake-up. When he was at Somerset House looking up Bendelow's death certificate, it occurred to him just to run his eye down the list and make sure that Cryle was still in the land of the living. And there, to his astonishment, he found Cryle's name. He was dead too. And not only was he dead, he also had died of cancer. It was the pancreas this time, another part of the gizzard. And he had died at Hoxton too, and he had died just 4 days before Bendelow. The thing was ridiculous. It looked like a conspiracy. But here again, everything was plain and above board. Wilson got a copy of the certificate and called on the doctor who had signed it, a man named Usher. Of course, Dr. Usher remembered all about the case as it occurred quite recently. There was not a shadow of doubt that Cryle was dead. Usher had helped to put him in his coffin and had attended at his funeral, and he too had no difficulty in picking out Cryle's photograph, and he had no doubt at all as to what Cryle died of. So there it was. Queer as it looked, there was no denying the plain facts. Those two crooks had slipped through the fingers of the law, so far as it was possible to see. But I must admit that I was not quite satisfied. The circumstances were so remarkably odd. I told Wilson so, and I advised him to look further into the matter. I reminded him of the D'Arblay murder and the finding of that guinea, but he said that the murder was our affair, that the men he had come to look for were dead, and that was all that concerned him. So back he went to New York, taking with him the death certificates and the 2 photographs with the certificates of recognition on the backs of them. But he left the notes of the case with me on the chance that they might be useful to me, and the 2 sets of fingerprints, which certainly don't seem likely to be of much use under the circumstances. You never know, said Thorndyke with an enigmatical smile. The superintendent gave him a quick, inquisitive look and agreed. No, you don't, especially when you are dealing with Dr. John Thorndyke. He pulled out his watch and, staring at it anxiously, exclaimed, What a confounded nuisance! I've got an appointment at the law courts in 5 minutes. It is quite a small matter. It won't take me more than half an hour. May I come back when I have finished? I should like to hear what you think of this extraordinary story. Come back by all means, said Thorndyke, and I will turn over the facts in my mind while you are gone. Possibly some suggestion may present itself in the interval. He let the officer out, and when the hurried footsteps had died away on the stairs, he closed the door and turned to me with a smile. Well, Gray, he said, what do you think of that? Isn't it a very pretty puzzle for a medical jurist? It is a hopeless tangle to me, I replied. My brain is in a whirl. You can't dispute the facts, and yet you can't believe them. I don't know what to make of the affair. You note the fact that whoever may be dead, there is somebody alive, very much alive, and that somebody is the murderer of Julius D'Arblay. Yes, I realize that, but obviously he can't be either Cryle or Bendelow. The question is, who is he? You note the link between him and the Van Zelen murder, the electrotyped guinea? Yes, there is evidently some connection, but I can't imagine what it can be. By the way, you notice that the American police had got muddled about the personal appearance of these 2 men. The description of that man who was seen coming away from Van Zelen's house, and who was said to be quite unlike Bendelow, actually fitted him perfectly. They had evidently made a mistake of some kind. Yes, I noticed that, but the description may have fitted Cryle better. We must get in touch with this man Usher. I wonder if he will be the Usher who used to attend at St. Margaret's. He is, and I am in touch with him already. In fact, he was telling me about this very patient, Jonathan Cryle. Indeed. Can you remember the substance of what he told you? I think so. It wasn't very thrilling. And here I gave him, as well as I could remember them, the details with which Usher had entertained me of his attendance on the late Jonathan Cryle, his dealings with the landlady, Mrs. Pepper, and the incidents of the funeral, including Usher's triumphant return in the mourning coach. It seemed a dull and trivial story, but Thorndyke listened to it with the keenest interest, and when I had finished he asked, He didn't happen to mention where Cryle lived, I suppose? Yes, curiously enough he did. The address, I remember, was 52 Field Street, Hoxton. "Ha!" said Thorndyke. "You were a mine of information, Gray." He rose and, taking down from the bookshelves Phillips' Atlas of London, opened it and pored over one of the maps. Then, replacing the atlas, he got out his notes of the D'Arblay case and searched for a particular entry. It was evidently quite a short one, for when he had found it, he gave it but a single glance and closed the portfolio. Then, returning to the bookshelves, he took out the post office directory and opened it at the street section. Here also his search was but a short one, though it appeared to be concerned with two separate items, for having examined one, he turned to a different part of the section to find the other. Finally he closed the unwieldy volume and, having replaced it on the shelf, turned and once more looked at me inquiringly. "Reflecting on what Miller has told us," he said, "does anything suggest itself to you? Any sort of hypothesis as to what the real facts may be?" "Nothing whatever," I replied. "The confusion that was already in my mind is only the worse confounded. But that is not your case, I take it." "Not entirely," he admitted. "The fact is that I had already formed a hypothesis as to the motives and circumstances which lay behind the murder of Julius D'Arblay, and I find this new matter not inconsistent with it. But that hypothesis may, nevertheless, turn out to be quite wrong when we put it to the test of further investigation." "You have some further investigation in view, then?" "Yes, I am going to make a proposal to Superintendent Miller, and here he comes, before his time, by which I judge that he also is keen on the solution of this puzzle." Thorndyke's opinion seemed to be justified, for the superintendent entered all agog and opened the subject at once. "Well, Doctor, I suppose you have been thinking over Wilson's story? How does it strike you? Have you come to any conclusion?" "Yes," replied Thorndyke. "I have come to the conclusion that I can't accept that story at its face value as representing the actual facts." Miller laughed with an air of mingled amusement and vexation. "That is just my position," said he. "The story seems incredible, but yet you can't raise any objection. The evidence in support of it is absolutely conclusive at every point. There isn't a single weak spot in it. At least I haven't found one. Perhaps you have?" And here he looked at Thorndyke with eager inquiry in his eyes. "I won't say that," Thorndyke replied, "but I put it to you, Miller, that the alleged facts that are offered are too abnormal to be entertained. We cannot accept that string of coincidences. It must be obvious to you that there is a fallacy somewhere, and that the actual facts are not what they seem." "Yes, I feel that myself," rejoined Miller. "But what are we to do? How are we to find the flaw in the evidence, if there is one? Can you see where to look for it? I believe you can." "I think there is one point which ought to be verified," said Thorndyke. "The identification of Cryle doesn't strike me as perfectly convincing." "How does this case differ from Bendelow's?" Miller demanded. "In two respects," was the reply. "First, Bendelow was identified by two persons, who had known him well for some time, and who gave a most circumstantial account of his illness, his death, and the disposal of his body, and second, Bendelow's remains have been cremated and are therefore presumably beyond our reach for purposes of identification." "Well," Miller objected, "Cryle isn't so very accessible, being some few feet underground." "Still, he is there, and he has been buried only a few weeks. It would be possible to exhume the body and settle the question of his identity once for all." "Then you are not satisfied with Dr. Usher's identification?" "No. Usher saw him only after a long wasting illness, which must have altered his appearance very greatly, whereas the photograph was taken when Cryle was in his normal health. It couldn't have been so very like Usher's patient." "That's true," said Miller, "and I remember that Usher wasn't so very positive, according to Wilson. But he agreed that it seemed to be the same man, and all the other facts seemed to point to the certainty that it was really Cryle. Still, you are not satisfied? It's a pity Wilson took the photograph back with him." "The photograph is of no consequence," said Thorndyke. "You have the fingerprints, properly authenticated fingerprints, actually taken from the man in the presence of witnesses. After this short time, it will be possible to get perfectly recognizable fingerprints from the body, and those fingerprints will settle the identity of Usher's patient beyond any possible doubt." The superintendent scratched his chin thoughtfully. "It's a bit of a job to get an exhumation order," said he. "Before I raise the question with the commissioner, I should like to have a rather more definite opinion from you. Did you seriously doubt that the man in that coffin is Jonathan Cryle?" "It is my opinion," replied Thorndyke. "Of course I may be wrong. But it is my considered opinion that the Cryle who is in that coffin is not the Cryle whose fingerprints are in your possession." "Very well, Doctor," said Miller, rising and picking up his hat. "That is good enough for me. I won't ask you for your reasons because I know you won't give them. But I have known you long enough to feel sure that you wouldn't give a definite opinion like that unless you had got something pretty solid to go on. And I don't think we shall have any difficulty about the exhumation order after what you have said." With this, the superintendent took his leave, and very shortly afterwards, Thorndyke carried me off to lunch at his club before dismissing me to take up my duties at the studio.